The Whitney Museum of American Art sits in the Meatpacking district of Manhattan, a Renzo piano building that opened in 2015, 8 stories of steel and glass and American cultural ambition made permanent. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney founded it in 1931. Her name is on the wall in the lobby. Her daughter's name was on the letterhead for nearly 2 decades after that. And somewhere in the family tree, a great-grandson named Whitney Tower Jr. was shooting heroin and trying to figure out what any of it was for. That arc spans 84 years. It didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It eroded, generation by generation, through women handed not just money, but meaning, and told to carry both forever. The museum still stands. The women who kept it standing aren't on the plaque. Start with the cage. Gertrude Vanderbilt was born on January 9, 1875, in New York City, the second daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, whose railroad empire extended from New York to Chicago and made the Vanderbilt name the closest thing America had to aristocracy. Her childhood home was a mansion at 742 Fifth Avenue. Summers were spent at the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. 70 rooms, a limestone facade, servants who outnumbered the family 3-1. She was educated by private tutors and at the Brearley School, trained from birth to perform the life she'd been born into. The performance had a very specific job description. A Vanderbilt daughter in the 1880s existed to be presented, to be admired, and to marry well enough that her family's position was confirmed rather than diluted. Ambition was acceptable only in the matrimonial direction. Art was a drawing room accomplishment, not a vocation. The kind of thing a well-bred girl could study without anyone taking it seriously, which was precisely the point. Gertrude later recalled longing to be a boy, comparing her constrained existence to the relative freedom enjoyed by her brothers. That longing didn't disappear as she grew up. It went underground and looked for a way out. On August 25, 1896, Gertrude married Harry Payne Whitney at age 21. From the outside, the match looked like exactly what it was designed to be, the joining of 2 of the largest fortunes in America. Harry was the son of politician William Collins Whitney and the nephew of a Standard Oil magnate. He would inherit fortunes in oil, tobacco, and banking. When he died in 1930, his estate was valued at $72 million. Gertrude had married into the only social world that didn't require her to explain where the money came from. What the marriage couldn't provide was witness. Harry Whitney had no interest in his wife's art and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Gertrude told an artist friend directly, "Never expect Harry to take your work seriously. It never has made any difference to him that I feel as I do about art, and it never will." She went further. Her wealth, she understood, put her in a position society hadn't constructed a door for. Accept commissions, and she was accused of taking income from artists who needed it more. Refuse them, and she was accused of undercutting the market by creating competition without needing the sale. A Vanderbilt woman who made sculpture professionally occupied a category that didn't officially exist. Her response was to build the category herself, starting from the outside of everything she was supposed to inhabit. She enrolled at the Art Students League of New York, studying under Hendrik Christian Andersen and James Earl Fraser alongside other students who would become major figures, Anna von Hyatt and Malvina Hoffman among them. In Paris, she trained with Andrew O'Connor and received direct criticism from Auguste Rodin, one of the dominant sculptors in the world. She was a serious student with serious intentions. Her first public sculpture commission, Aspiration, appeared at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, displayed under an assumed name. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, one of the most recognized women in America, showed her work anonymously because she was afraid of being dismissed as a socialite with clay on her hands. By 1907, she had established a studio and apartment in Greenwich Village, where the social architecture of the Upper East Side didn't apply. In 1908, the Whitney Studio Gallery opened on West 8th Street. By 1910, she was exhibiting under her own name. In 1914, she established the Whitney Studio Club at 147 West 4th Street, an artists' gathering space where young painters and sculptors could meet, work, exhibit, and find a patron who would actually buy their work rather than admire it condescendingly. She provided nearby housing for some artists. She covered living stipends. She wasn't visiting the bohemian world. She was financing it and shaping it from inside. The list of artists she supported reads like a syllabus for American modernism. Edward Hopper, George Bellows, Stuart Davis, John Sloan, Charles Demuth, Reginald Marsh, Yasuo Kuniyoshi. She bought actively from the Ashcan School when its gritty urban realism was considered low and provincial by the cultural establishment. In 1922, she personally financed the publication of The Arts magazine to prevent it from folding entirely. None of this was passive philanthropy. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was building the infrastructure for an American art world that the official institutions refused to support. The Metropolitan Museum of Art made their position explicit in 1929. That year, Gertrude offered the Met approximately 700 works from her personal collection, along with an endowment sufficient to construct a dedicated building to house them. The Met declined. Their stated reason was that they collected only European art, that American art was too provincial, too recent, too local to merit the institution's attention. The offer included the money to build the building. The Met still said no. Gertrude was, by all accounts, undaunted. If the most powerful museum in America wouldn't house American artists, she would build one that would, and she would put it in the neighborhood where she'd been quietly sustaining those artists for 20 years. The Whitney Museum of American Art opened on November 18, 1931, at 8 West 8th Street in Greenwich Village. Its founding collection was built from the works she'd spent decades acquiring, from artists the establishment had told her didn't matter. The building stood around the corner from the studio where she'd carved her first anonymous sculpture. The Met's rejection letter had functioned as a founding document. She had 12 years to run the institution before it became someone else's obligation. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died on April 18, 1942, at age 67, of a heart condition. Newspaper estimates at the time put her estate between $25 and $50 million. The actual accounting came in at $10,590,492. Gilded Age fortunes were already bleeding out by mid-century, spent on studios, on magazines, on artists, on institutions, on the slow project of building a cultural world that outlived the people who funded it. She left $2.5 million directly to the Whitney Museum, $50,000 to founding director Juliana Force, and smaller bequests to her maid and her chauffeur. The rest passed to her children, and with it passed something harder to measure than dollars. Her daughter Flora was 44 years old. Flora Payne Whitney was born on July 29, 1897, in Newport, Rhode Island. She grew up in the same gilded architecture as her mother, Brearley School in New York, then Foxcroft School in Virginia, and understood from childhood the weight of the name she was performing. At 18, she wrote, "I really feel much worse about not being able to talk to Mama than anyone thinks I do. Oh, it's awful. If only I could. I admire and respect and of course adore Mama, but there is no companionship at all." That distance defined the relationship. Gertrude was building a museum and sustaining an artistic revolution. Her daughter watched from the periphery and couldn't find a way in. Flora's early adult life had its own grief entirely separate from the family institution. She had been engaged to Quentin Roosevelt, the youngest son of President Theodore Roosevelt. On July 14, 1918, Quentin was killed in aerial combat over Germany. Flora was 20 years old. She married Roderick Tower, a stockbroker, in April 1920. They had 2 children, Pamela and Whitney Tower, and divorced in 1925. In February 1927, she married George McCulloch Miller, an artist and businessman her daughter would later describe as a man she had much in common with. The couple settled into a house in Aiken, South Carolina, given to them by Gertrude. They had 2 more children, Flora and Leverett. Flora Miller Biddle, the daughter who would eventually document all of this in print, later recalled her parents as people who actively sought pleasure, fun, the good life, and who were frequently absent, their children raised largely by a strict nanny in what should have been an idyllic setting. Then Gertrude died, and the museum descended. Flora didn't choose the Whitney Museum the way her mother had. Gertrude built it from defiance and from the specific injury of the Met's rejection. Flora stepped into it because she was the eldest daughter, and somebody had to. Flora Miller Biddle later wrote that her mother's grief after Gertrude's death poured into the museum, enriching it for more than 25 years and holding Gertrude's passionate commitment fast. Mourning transformed into programming. Loss converted into institutional duty. Flora served as museum president from 1942 to 1966, then as chairman through 1977. 35 years of stewardship for an institution she hadn't founded and hadn't chosen. Under her direction, the Whitney expanded its collection, broadened its programming, and moved twice, once in 1954 and again in 1966, to a new building on Madison Avenue designed by Marcel Breuer. The Breuer building's brutalist concrete exterior looked nothing like anything else on the Upper East Side, which was the point. Gertrude's museum had never been interested in blending in. The financial reality behind the institutional prestige was becoming harder to manage. In 1961, the board was forced to add outside trustees for the first time, Roy Neuberger and Arthur Altschul among them. It was a structural admission that the Whitney family's personal resources could no longer carry the institution alone. Flora had inherited $1 million outright from her father Harry's estate in 1930, plus the income from a trust fund valued at approximately $15 million. Substantial wealth, but not infinite wealth, stretched across 3 decades of museum operations. In 1980, Flora sold a Turner painting from her own personal collection at Sotheby's, Juliet and Her Nurse, for $6.4 million, then the highest price ever paid for any painting at auction. She donated a portion of the proceeds to the museum. A woman liquidating her own inherited art to keep her dead mother's institution solvent isn't a triumphant legacy story. It's a different story entirely. The museum's artists recognized what she was giving it. Jack Bauer, who served as director from 1968 to 1974, later said, "Her kindness tamed Philip Evergood's distrust of the rich and dispelled Charles Birchfield's social inarticulateness. Her spirit played a crucial part in establishing and nourishing the Whitneys' policy of supporting living artists. We all loved her. The artists loved her. The institution consumed her." Whether Flora Whitney Miller ever fully separated those two facts is a question her daughter spent a book trying to answer. Barbara Whitney, the younger sister, was born on March 20, 1903 in Manhattan. 6 years younger than Flora, she inhabited the same family world. Same Newport summers, same Vanderbilt Whitney name, same social expectations of a woman born into that particular fortune. Where Flora became the institution's custodian, Barbara moved at a different angle. She married 3 times: Barclay McKee Henry in 1924, Samuel Anderson Peck in 1947, and George William Headley in 1960. Hedley was a jewelry designer who opened the Whitney Museum in Lexington, Kentucky, in 1968. A smaller, stranger institution than her mother's, built around decorative arts and bibelots. Barbara ended up adjacent to a museum by marriage, in a different state, which might be the most telling detail her life provides. The documentary record of Barbara's inner life is thin. She appears in Flora Miller Biddle's memoir primarily as a potential source of financial help during the Whitneys' difficult early decades. She died on December 17, 1982, in Manhattan, at age 79. She left less of a paper trail than either her mother or her sister. Not every Whitney woman was consumed by the institution. Some lived at its edges and died quietly while it continued. That contrast, Flora's absorption versus Barbara's adjacency, is itself part of what the Whitney inheritance actually meant. The same name, the same fortune, and profoundly different fates depending on which daughter happened to be oldest. The granddaughter who put all of this on paper was Flora Miller Biddle. Born in 1928, she became a museum trustee in 1958 and president of the Whitney in 1977, after her mother had stepped back from day-to-day control. She later wrote of the handoff, "In 1967, my mother, Flora Whitney Miller, passed it on to me." Passed, as in a relay. As in something you don't choose to receive. You just don't drop it when it comes to you. She served as president through the mid-1990s, and in 1999, she published The Whitney Women and the Museum They Made, a family memoir, the most honest account of what the inheritance had actually cost. Her central image for the institution she'd spent her adult life inside is worth quoting in full. The Whitney had been, in turn, mother, sister, child, and lover. It's given me a richer life than I could possibly have imagined for myself. And it's given me more pain, too. Plus, a true education. 3 generations of women are compressed into those 3 sentences. Gertrude built the mother. Flora Payne became its most devoted daughter. Flora Miller Biddle spent her adult life determining which of the 2 roles she was actually playing. The memoir doesn't resolve the question. It documents it. What it also documents is the financial erosion that the family's public image concealed. The Whitney family wealth that had made the institution possible was contracting across generations, while the institution's scale and costs expanded. By mid-century, the museum required professional management, a permanent staff, and consistent fundraising at a level no single family could sustain privately. The Whitneys were expected to feel personally responsible for it, regardless of whether that responsibility was financially viable. Flora Miller Biddle stepped down in the mid-1990s. Her daughter Fiona Donovan served on the board until 2003. In 2014, the museum brought Fiona back, along with 2 fifth-generation members, Flora Donovan and Flora Irving. The family name persisted as an institutional brand. The fortune that had originally given that name its meaning had not kept pace. Whitney Tower Jr. is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's great-grandson. He isn't a woman, and he isn't a museum president, and he didn't write a memoir. What he did, and what Michael Gross documented in Flight of the Wasp, was develop a serious heroin addiction, and connected explicitly to the particular hollowness of inheriting a famous name and a trust fund without inheriting the purpose that had made either of those things bearable for the people who built them. He is the dark punctuation mark at the end of the family's sentence. Not because addiction is the inevitable outcome of inherited wealth, it isn't, but because of the specific thing that ran out before it reached him. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had turned the weight of the family name into art, and then into an institution. Flora Payne Whitney had turned grief into 35 years of service. Flora Miller Biddle had turned the burden into documentation. Each generation had found a mechanism, a way to convert the pressure of the inheritance into something external and purposeful. By the time the money and the name reached Whitney Tower Jr., the mechanism was gone. The museum had outgrown the family's financial control decades earlier. The institutional role had passed to professional directors and outside boards. What remained was the name, the trust fund, the social weight of belonging to one of the most recognizable dynasties in American history. And no art, no mission, no founding vision to make any of it meaningful. The heroine filled a space that the inheritance had created and then left empty. That is the story the title is actually promising. Not sisters destroyed in the dramatic tabloid sense. The destruction was slower and quieter, and spread across 4 generations. Gertrude cracked the ornamental mold her class had built for her and used the fracture to build something lasting. Her daughters inherited the building, not the fracture. The obligation without the original defiance that had made it livable. Her granddaughter inherited enough self-awareness to document the toll, and the great-grandson inherited what was left when documentation was finished and the institution had moved on. The Whitney Museum relocated to its current home, Renzo Piano's building on Gansevoort Street, in 2015. It holds a permanent collection built across nearly a century of acquisitions. Its founding patron's name is on the wall in the lobby, as it has been since 1931, the year a woman offered 700 paintings to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was told American art wasn't worth their wall space, and decided to build her own museum rather than argue the point. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney spent years showing her work under an assumed name. She was afraid that the name she actually had would be used against her. The institution she built now carries that name into its 2nd century, long after the women who sustained it between 1942 and the mid-1990s have stopped being mentioned on the plaques. Institutions outlast the people who make them possible. The Whitney has. Whether that's a tribute or a verdict depends on which generation of women you're asking, and by now, several of them are no longer available to answer. Subscribe for more stories like this one.